So South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung is in New Delhi to hold a summit with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi before heading to Vietnam on Tuesday. For more, we're joined today by Professor Daniel Connolly, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Connolly, thanks for coming on today.
Good morning.
So this visit marks the first state visit to India by a Korean president in 8 years, right? In the context of Global South diplomacy, why are India and Vietnam being prioritized as the twin pillars of Korea's current foreign policy?
I think South Korea is prioritizing these countries for several reasons. First, we have to remember from a historical perspective, President Moon's New Southern Policy, Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy, both generally centered on ASEAN and Southeast Asia as a key area for Korean policy. And I think although names and terminology changes, South Korea's advanced technology, its need to produce electronics, make the region, which is rich in natural resources and fairly cheap labor, a very natural target for South Korea's policymakers. And I would say this move to Southeast Asia was part of a general shift away from the Chinese market, which the U.S. has always supported. But I would say today's prioritization of this relationship with India and Vietnam are also being driven by an unspoken need to de-risk away from the U.S. market. Under President Trump, the United States has become very predatory. So creating deeper economic relationships with the Global South is a good way for South Korea to insulate itself from both Chinese and U.S. economic coercion. And I would say if we look at it from this perspective, there's a big difference between earlier Indo-Pacific strategy, which kind of sees a liberal world order led by the United States, and today's much more pragmatic Global South diplomacy, which is admitting that a multipolar world exists and Korea has to find its place in it.
Right, and the Blue House has said these summits will focus on energy supply chain stability, especially with the ongoing situation in the Middle East. So realistically, how much can strengthening ties with India and Vietnam sort of insulate the Korean economy from global shocks?
Frankly, probably not a lot. I would say all three countries are in a very similar boat. They're all high energy consumers, not producers. South Korea and India are both very major refiners of petroleum, but they're not actual, producers of petroleum itself. So I would say this is basically a meeting of victims of the U.S. war in Iran and the Iranian blockade of Hormuz. So at best, they're going to exchange some information on energy supply chains, maybe aligning policies, but there's not really a lot they can do. And maybe adaptation is the best we can hope for because these countries are in a similar situation and can maybe teach each other what they've been doing.
I see. And we are seeing a significant economic delegation accompanying President Lee on this trip, including the heads of companies like Samsung, SK, Hyundai, and LG. And while Samsung and LG are looking at both nations, Hyundai is focusing heavily on India and SK on Vietnam's energy sector. So what does this sort of divided strategy tell us about how the Korean industry views the different roles India and Vietnam play?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think broadly what we're witnessing here is maybe a growing evolution and sophistication of how Korean companies approach the region. I would say in the past, South Korea prioritized Western, US and European markets, and they saw Southeast Asia and places like India as a source of maybe labor and resources. But these regions today are the source of a huge growing middle class of consumers. India has a vast population, Vietnam has a large growing middle class. So I think right now what's happening is, unlike the past where Korean companies prioritize China for production chains, United States for consumers, I would say that Southeast Asia and India today is perhaps becoming a source of both new production chains and new markets. And I think this complexity explains the diverse ways that Korean companies are approaching the region. And it's not just production anymore, but also co-production with local partners. Because let's be honest, both India and Vietnam have strong governments that want to also expand their own indigenous manufacturing sectors.
Right, right. And after he wraps up his trip to India, President Lee Jae-myung will be heading to Vietnam. He will be the first state guest for Vietnam's newly appointed leadership. Beyond the focus on minerals, what's the symbolic importance of the timing, and how does it solidify Korea's position as sort of a top-tier partner to Vietnam?
Right, absolutely. To Lam, he just got back from a visit to Beijing. So, President Lee is the second leader he's having a one-on-one summit with since his selection as president. Korea is clearly a very favored partner of Vietnam. The meeting they're going to have is probably going to focus on energy security, rail, urban projects, and I would say high-tech cooperation. And it's really important to remember just how important Vietnam is for South Korea as well. It's one of the largest trade surpluses with Vietnam, second only to the United States. And I think this is a really important sign, not only of South Korea diversifying away from the US market and for exports, but also Vietnam's perspective. We're in a world where hegemons, the United States and China, are becoming much more predatory. So countries in the global south like Vietnam, I suggest they see a greater value in cooperating with South Korea because this cooperation can be much more equal and much less hierarchical. And I think the pragmatic diplomacy of President Lee is very well suited to take advantage of this opportunity.
I see. All right, Professor Connolly, thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.